She hid her children every single time a rider appeared on the horizon, not because she was guilty of anything, but because the land had taught her what silence could not protect. Out here, in the forgotten stretch of the West, even a passing horse could mean the return of something she had spent years trying to outrun. No one asked questions in this place because the answers always came with consequences. Then one morning, a cowboy dismounted by her fence, and instead of riding away like the others, he stayed, watched, waited, and for the first time, she didn't run. This channel tells Western stories of cowboys, broken lands, quiet love, motherhood, and the kind of human compassion that survives even when the world forgets to be gentle. At its heart, this story is a reminder that fear is often inherited, not chosen, and healing doesn't begin when danger disappears, but when someone finally stays long enough for trust to grow again. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to comment your thoughts, share it with someone who loves emotional Western tales, and subscribe for more stories that explore love, loss, and humanity in the untamed West.
The morning came in without softness. Wind moved across the broken ranch like it had nowhere else to be, slipping through gaps in old boards, pressing against the barn walls, as if it was testing what still had strength left in it. The sky was pale, almost washed out, the kind of gray that didn't promise rain, but still made everything feel heavier than it should. Somewhere far off, a hawk cut through the air, but even that sound felt distant, like it belonged to another life. He was already outside before the sun fully showed itself. That had become a habit more than a choice. The man stood near the eastern fence line, boots sunk slightly into dry soil that cracked under pressure like old bone. The fence had fallen again during the night. Not completely, just enough to remind him that nothing on this land stayed where it was supposed to. One post leaned sideways, rope bindings loosened, wire hanging like tired nerves. He didn't rush to fix it. There was no point in rushing anything anymore. He crouched, picked up the post with both hands, and felt the weight of it. Not heavy in a physical sense. Heavy in the way things become heavy when you already know they were going to fail again. Behind him, the barn door creaked once as the wind shifted. A sound like an old complaint. The land was supposed to be his responsibility. That was what people in town still said when they saw him, if they bothered to say anything at all. Responsibility. Duty. Words that sounded solid when spoken by people who had never had to hold them in their hands. But responsibility didn't feel like ownership. It felt like debt, and debt was the only thing that still had structure in his life. He glanced toward the barn. A white envelope was nailed to the wood, fluttering slightly whenever the wind hit it. He really knew what it said without reading it again. He had read it enough times that the words had started to feel like part of the grain of the wood itself. Final notice, payment overdue, action pending. It didn't matter which version they used. The meaning never changed. He stood up slowly, rolled his shoulders, and exhaled through his nose. The air was cold enough to sting, but he barely noticed it anymore. Cold was just another condition of the place. Like silence, like waiting. There was a time when this land had been different. Not better, just alive in a different way. He didn't allow himself to think about that too long. Memory was dangerous. It didn't heal anything. It only reminded you of what you now no longer had the right to touch. He turned back to the fence and began working. The tools were old. Some of them weren't even his. They had belonged to someone who wasn't here anymore. Someone whose absence still shaped the way the ranch felt. Every strike of metal against wood carried a faint echo of that absence, like the land itself remembered things he tried not to. He hammered once, twice. The post didn't settle the way it should. He adjusted it, forced it deeper into the ground. A third strike. The sound carried too far in the quiet morning. He paused, listening not because he expected anything, but because silence on this land had a habit of breaking in ways you couldn't predict.
Nothing.
Just wind. Still, something inside him stayed alert. Not fear exactly, more like conditioning. The kind you don't notice until it becomes part of how you move through the world. He tightened the rope and stepped back. The fence would hold for now. That was all anything did here. Hold for now. As he stood there, a sheep moved at the edge of the property line. A horse, then another. Riders, they were still far enough away that he couldn't make out faces, only silhouettes, cutting across the pale horizon. The sound came later, delayed by distant hooves against dry ground, steady and unhurried. His jaw tightened slightly, though he didn't move. Riders passing through wasn't unusual. This was open land. People came and went. That was how it worked. But lately, he had started noticing how the land seemed to shift when certain riders passed. Not all of them, just some. He couldn't explain why he noticed the difference, only that he did. He watched them approach the road that cut along the edge of the property. 3 riders, dust rising behind them like some smoke that didn't belong to fire. He turned back toward the barn, then stopped. A sound interrupted the rhythm of the morning. A door closing too quickly. Not his barn. He looked again. Near the smaller structure by the old irrigation ditch, a figure moved. A woman. She was running, not exactly, but she moved with urgency, like the kind of urgency that came from habit rather than panic. Behind her, 2 small shapes followed. Children. The woman reached the small shed first, pulling the children inside without hesitation. The door closed immediately after. No pause, no hesitation. Just practiced motion, like something rehearsed too many times to count. The man stood still. He didn't understand what he was looking at, but he understood enough to recognize pattern. The riders were still approaching, and every time their presence became visible, she reacted. Not to him, not to the land, to them. The riders passed along the road without stopping. Their voices were low, indistinct. One of them laughed at something the others said. It was normal, ordinary. Nothing about them suggested danger. And yet, behind the shed, the woman remained hidden, the children too. The man slowly lowered the hammer in his hand. His first instinct was simple. Don't interfere. That instinct had kept him alive longer than most of his decisions ever had. But something about the repetition of it made no sense. The riders disappeared down the road, their sound fading into distance. Only then did the shed door open again. The woman stepped out first, scanning the road until she was sure it was empty. Then she reached back and guided the children out. Her movements were careful, controlled, almost mechanical, like she was returning to a world she didn't fully trust. The children stayed close to her legs. Too close. He watched without moving closer. There was a kind of boundary in moments like this. Not physical. Something quieter. Something you learn to recognize if you spent enough time around people who had reasons to be afraid of things they couldn't explain. She didn't look toward him yet, but he knew he was there. Most people did. The ranch didn't offer much hiding space. She adjusted the children's clothing, small, unnecessary movements that looked more like grounding than correction. Then she glanced toward the barn, toward him. Just once? Not long enough to read anything, but long enough for him to notice something in her expression. Not fear of him, something more specific, something directed outward. He tightened his grip on the hammer again, without realizing it. The moment passed. She turned back toward the shed, guiding the children inside. And then, just before the door closed again, She looked once more toward the road, like she was waiting for it to come back. The man stood there for a long time after that. The fence remained half repaired. The barn door still carried its warning. But none of that felt like the most important thing anymore. Because now there was something else on the land that did belong to debt or whether, remembering a woman who hid her children every time men rode past. And a question that didn't have a place to go. And he finally set the hammer down slowly, like even the sound of it might mean something he wasn't ready to understand. And for the first time that morning, he stopped working, not because the job was done, but because something had changed the shape of the day. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough to be noticed. Somewhere beyond the fence, the wind kept moving through the empty land. But now it didn't feel entirely empty anymore. The afternoon light had shifted by the time he saw her properly. It wasn't the kind of light that softened anything. In this part of the land, afternoon sun only made things more honest, showing every crack in wood, every uneven line in the soil, every place where time had done its quiet work of breaking things down without asking permission. He had gone back to the fence after she disappeared into the shed earlier, trying to finish what his hands had already started before his mind began drifting. The hammer felt heavier now, not because the work had changed, but because something in him kept replaying what he had seen without asking for it. A woman stepping into a shed too quickly, two children following her like instinct rather than choice. A closed order that looked less like shelter and more like habit. He didn't like questions that didn't have a place to land. They had a way of staying longer than they should. By the time he walked toward the main yard again, the sound of movement reached him before the sight of her did. A low rhythm wood shifting, tools being set down carefully, the faint scrape of something being dragged across packed earth. He stopped near the edge of the yard without announcing himself. She was there, closer now. Not in the shed this time, but in the open space beside it where the ground had been cleared long ago for storage and repair work. She was stacking firewood, her movements steady, deliberate. The children were nearby, not far enough to be separate, not close enough to be in the way. They were sitting on an overturned crate, watching quietly, as if they had already learned that silence was part of survival. The man didn't step forward immediately. Something about the scene made him hesitate in a way he couldn't fully explain. It was its fragility he saw. It was structure, a kind of order built out of necessity rather than comfort. She noticed him before she turned. He could tell by the slight pause in her movement, a fractions of stillness that didn't belong to work. Then she looked at him, not surprised, not afraid, just aware, like someone who had already accounted for his presence in the world and decided it would not change what she needed to do. He stayed where he was. There was a rule in places like this that nobody ever wrote down, but everyone seemed to understand. You didn't step too quickly into someone else's space when their life already looked like it had been rearranged too many times. I can start on the north fence today, he said finally, voice low. Neutral. She nodded once, no hesitation, no unnecessary words. That was the first thing that struck him, not her appearance, not even her silence, but how carefully she used it. Like every word had a cost. He adjusted his grip on the hammer at his side. There's feed in the barn if the kids need anything. Another nod. The children glanced at him then. Not openly, not with curiosity that turned into questions. More like cautious awareness. The kind that came from learning early that adults could change mood without warning. The boy, older of the two, leaned slightly closer to the girl beside him. A protective motion that didn't look taut, only lived. The man felt something tighten in his chest, but he didn't name it. He had seen enough hardship to recognize it without needing to attach language to it. Still, there was something different about this. Not the hardship itself, the way it was arranged. The woman set down the last piece of wood and wiped her hands on her trousers. Only then did she fully face him. Up close, she looked more tired than he had expected. Not in a way that suggested weakness, but in a way that suggested repetition. The kind of exhaustion that does come from one event, but from too many mornings that look the same in ways you can't fix. "You staying on the East Line?" he asked. Her voice was steady, controlled, no unnecessary softness. He nodded. "That's where it needs work first." She didn't question him further. Instead, she glanced toward the road beyond the yard. He noticed it immediately. Not a casual glance. A check, like someone confirming distance, direction, possibility. His eyes followed hers out of instinct. The road was empty. Only dust and heat where the riders had passed earlier. Still, something in her posture didn't relax. He decided not to ask, not yet. Questions had a way of breaking things before you understood what you were holding. Instead, he turned slightly and started toward the east fence again. He expected her to go back to her work. She didn't immediately. That was the second thing he noticed. She stayed still for a moment, longer than necessary, watching the road. Then, slowly, she moved back toward the children. Not hurried, but careful. Like the world might change again without warning. He worked for almost an hour without speaking to anyone. The fence demanded attention in a way that didn't allow distraction. Posts needed resetting, wire needed tightening, and the ground itself seemed to resist being set back into order. Every time he thought he had fixed one section, another part shifted, as if reminding him that nothing here stayed fixed for long. But even while his hands worked, his awareness stayed divided. He could feel her presence without looking. Not because she was loud, because she wasn't. Silence, when it belongs to someone specific, has weight. At one point, he heard movement behind him. Not footsteps approaching directly, but the soft sound of someone adjusting positions. Maybe moving tools, maybe repositioning the children where they would be out of sight from the road. He didn't turn around, but he knew exactly what she was doing, and that knowledge unsettled him more than any question would have. Around midday, the sound of horses returned. Not close at first, just distant enough to be noticed. He stopped working. This time, he didn't need to look up immediately to know what would happen. He heard it in the change of rhythm in the air. She noticed it too. He saw it when he finally turned. She had already moved. Not running, not panicked, but precise. The children were pulled back toward the shed again. The same structure, the same motion, repeated, with the kind of certainty that came from practice rather than fear alone. The door closed quickly. Too quickly. The riders were still far off when she sealed them inside. He stood still this time. Hammer lowered, but not dropped. He watched the road, 3 riders again. Same direction, same slow passage. They weren't looking toward the ranch. They weren't speaking loudly. Nothing her reaction he couldn't reconcile. Feels were just one tangent. Gone again, only dust remained. Shed door opened once more. She stepped out first, then the children. Same sequence, same control, But something had shifted slightly this time, not in her actions, in the air around her. He set the hammer down on the ground slowly. She noticed it. He could tell by the way her eyes briefly flicked toward him. Not long enough to read him, but long enough to register that he was still there. He took a step closer, not toward her directly, but into the shared space between fence and shed. "Those riders," he said carefully, "do they come through often?" She didn't answer immediately. That pause mattered more than the words that followed. "Sometimes," she said finally. A simple answer. Too simple, he waited, but she didn't add more. The children had gone quiet again, watching him from behind at her legs. The older one, S hand, stayed lightly on the younger S shoulder. He noticed that too. Not fear exactly. Preparation. Like they had learned what silence meant before they learned what safety felt like. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Do you need help with anything near the road?" he asked. She looked at him then. Longer this time, not suspicious, measuring. Like she was deciding whether accepting help would cost more than refusing it. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she said. Then, after a beat, softer but still controlled. "We manage." "We," that word stayed with him longer than the rest of the conversation because it was singular and it was to his. It belonged to something he hadn't been included in yet. He nodded once, and instead of pushing further, he turned back toward the fence. But as he walked away, he realized something simple and uncomfortable. The land was not the only thing carrying damage here. It was the way people learned to live inside it. And, for the first time since he had come back to this broken place, he wasn't sure whether he was repairing a fence or stepping into something that had already been fractured long before he arrived. The morning did not feel any different from the ones before it, but something in him had already shifted in ways he couldn't name. He woke before sunrise, as he always did, but instead of going straight to the east fence like he had planned the night before, he found himself standing still inside the barn for a moment longer than usual. The air inside was colder than outside, holding the smell of old wood, dry hay, and metal that had not been cleaned in years. It was the kind of place that remembered everything that had ever been done inside it, even when no one else did. He ran a hand along the edge of a worn wooden beam, not thinking about it at first, only feeling it. The texture was familiar in the way old work becomes familiar, not comforting, but known. And yet this morning, even that familiarity felt slightly displaced, like something had been added to his life without asking permission. Her presence, not physically in the barn, not even close, but present in the way certain questions linger after they are first noticed. Why did she hide the children? Why did she react to riders in a way that had nothing to do with distance or danger? Why did she say we instead of I? He exhaled slowly and stepped outside before the thoughts could settle too deeply. The ranch was still quiet. The land always looked most honest in early morning light, before heat and labor softened its edges. The fence line waited for him in the distance, still half finished from yesterday. That should have been enough to pull his attention forward. Work usually had a way of clearing the mind, but when he reached the yard, he noticed something different. She was already awake. That was the first change. She was not inside the shed or hidden behind any structure. She was in the open space beside the barn, kneeling near a water basin, washing something he couldn't immediately see. The children were nearby again, but not sitting this time. The older child stood a little farther back, watching her. The younger one crouched closer, playing quietly with a small object in the dirt. No panic, no sudden movements. but still careful. Everything about them was careful. He slowed his steps without meaning to. She noticed him quickly, as she always did, but this time she did immediately pause what she was doing. That small difference caught his attention. Instead of freezing or redirecting her focus entirely, she simply lifted her head briefly, acknowledged him with a glance, then continued washing whatever she had in the basin. It wasn't tea dismissal. It was trust measured in increments too small to call trust yet. He stopped a few feet away, near the edge of the barn's shadow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound was water moving against metal and the occasional shift of dirt under the children's feet. He realized then that silence between them was becoming structured, not empty anymore. Something was forming inside it, even if neither of them had agreed to shape it. "You were up early." It wasn't a question. She nodded slightly without looking up. "The mornings are easier." He didn't ask easier than what he already expected. The answer would not be simple. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the children again. The older one had moved closer to the shed wall, leaning lightly against it. The younger one was still absorbed in the dirt, drawing lines that didn't seem to form anything specific. Just movement for the sake of movement. "They eat yet?" he asked. Another pause. Short trolled, "Yes." One word. Again he nodded, but didn't move closer. There was a rhythm to the way she responded to him. Minimal, deliberate. Careful. Not to give more than necessary. It was a rudeness. It's protection. He could recognize that much now, even if he didn't yet understand what she was protecting them from. He turned slightly toward the barn, then stopped again. The sound of distant hooves reached them before the riders appeared. This time, he noticed something different immediately, not the riders themselves, but the reaction that followed the sound. She froze. Not dramatically, not visibly panicked, but completely, like her body had been trained to respond before thought could intervene. The children reacted at the same time. The older one stood instantly. The younger one looked up, confused but already shifting toward her, and she moved. Fast, not chaotic, not uncertain. Efficiency reached for both children at once, with the guiding them toward the shed. Almost didn't look like fear anymore. It looked like procedure, like something done so many times it had become part of the land itself. The man stepped forward, slightly without thinking. "Wait," he started. But she was already closing the shed door, not slamming it, closing it carefully but quickly enough that there was no room for delay, and then she was gone from sight. Again, he stood still. The riders were still distant, just silhouettes, forming against the pale horizon. He could see them clearly now, 3 men, moving at an easy pace, not rushing, not searching, not even particularly attentive to the land around them. Ordinary riders. That was what made it worse. Nothing about them explained her reaction. The hooves grew louder, closer, then passed, exactly like before. No deviation, no interruption, no attention toward the ranch. One of them lifted a hand in casual greeting toward something unseen down the road, and then they were gone. The sound faded slowly, swallowed by distance and wind. Only dust remained. He stayed where he was, watching the empty road longer than necessary. Behind him, the shed door opened again. She stepped out first, then the children. Same order, same controlled re-entry into the world. But this time, something inside him didn't settle the way it had before. He turned slowly toward her. She was already watching the road, not him. The road, like she was confirming reality, had stayed consistent. He waited until she looked away before speaking. "This happens every time," he said. "Not an accusation. A fact spoken carefully. Her eyes shifted toward him, but only briefly. Yes, she said. That was all. No explanation followed. He tightened his jaw slightly. Not out of frustration exactly, but out of the pressure that comes when something doesn't fit into the structure you understand. That is not normal, he said quietly. This time she didn't answer immediately. The children had moved closer to her again, instinctively the older one, half behind her, the younger pressing against her leg. She looked down at them first, then back at him. It is here, she said. Simple, final. He absorbed that without speaking for a moment. There was something in the way she said that made it clear she wasn't discussing opinion. She was describing experience. He shifted his weight slightly, looking toward the fence line, toward the open road, toward the land that stretched far beyond what either of them controlled. There are a lot of riders on this road, he said. Most of them don't. They don't even look this way, I know, she said. The way she answered told him she already understood more about the area than he assumed. That realization added another layer he didn't like. She wasn't new here. Not really. He studied her for a moment longer, then spoke again, more carefully this time. Then, what are you afraid of? The question landed between them without force, but it changed the air anyway. She didn't respond immediately, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something different in her hesitation. Not avoidance, conflict. Like answering would require her to open something she'd had kept sealed for a long time. The children were still. Even they seemed to understand that the world had shifted slightly in this moment. Finally, she spoke, not looking at him directly. Not all riders are the same, she said. He waited, but she didn't continue. That was the end of her explanation, and somehow it was both too little and too much at the same time. He nodded slowly, though he didn't fully accept what had been left unsaid, but he didn't push further, not yet. Instead, he turned back toward the fence again, because work was still there, because the land still needed repair, and because some questions he was beginning to realize did not open when asked. They opened when people were ready to survive them. By the time the fourth morning arrived, the ranch no longer felt like a place that simply existed in time. It felt like a place that was slowly accumulating something unspoken, something that didn't have a name yet, but was already changing the way the air moved between people. He noticed it before he even stepped outside. The silence inside the house was different. Not louder, just shared. That was the only word that came close. For years, silence had belonged only to him. It had been something he carried without thinking, something that filled rooms the way dust filled corners, inevitable, unnoticed, permanent. But now, it felt divided, as if someone else had entered it, without permission, and learned how to exist inside it without breaking it. He stood by the doorway for a moment longer than usual, one hand resting on the frame, listening. No voices, no movement, but not absence either, presence. He stepped outside. The morning was pale again, but softer than before. Not warmer, not kinder, just less sharp. The wind moved through the yard in slow passes, brushing against the barn, slide-stanging across the fence line he still hadn't fully finished, and disappearing into the open land beyond. And then he saw her. She was already working, not in the shed, not hidden, outside. That alone made him slow his steps. She stood near the water trough, sleeves rolled up, arms steady, as she scrubbed something he could immediately identify. The children were nearby again, but not clinging to her this time. They were closer to the barn wall, sitting in a small patch of sunlight that barely reached the ground. They were quiet, but not withdrawn. It was a different kind of quiet, one that suggested they were learning the shape of the place instead of defending themselves from it. He watched for a moment before approaching. There was something different in the way she moved today. Less reactive, more grounded, as if she had measured the space around her and decided it would not collapse. He stopped a few feet away. She noticed him, but didn't pause immediately. That small delay told him more than words ever had. "You rechanging the water?" he asked, finally nodding toward the trough. "Yes," she said, simply. He glanced at the children again. The younger one was tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. The older one was watching the barn door, but not with the same tension as before. More like habit now than fear. "You don't react the same way as before," he said after a moment. She looked at him then longer defensive, not inviting either. "Just steady. The sound does change," she said, "so I don't need to react differently." He understood the words, but not the weight behind them. He leaned slightly against the barn wall, folding his arms loosely. Not closing himself off, just grounding himself. "That's not what I meant," he said. She continued working for a moment, as if deciding whether the conversation required full attention. Then she set the cloth down and turned slightly toward him. The children did move. That, too, was new. A few days ago, they would have stopped everything immediately. Now they only paused briefly before continuing their quiet play. "You were watching us too closely," she said. There was no accusation in it, just observation. He exhaled through his nose, not denying it immediately because it would have been dishonest. "I don't understand what I am seeing," he admitted. That was closer to truth than anything he had said since she arrived. She nodded once, as if that answer made more sense than the question itself. A distant sound of wood shifting echoed somewhere near the barn roof, the kind of sound the structure made when temperature changed, or when wind pressed against old joints. Neither of them reacted. That was small change. He hesitated. The world still made, but not every sound required movement anymore. After a moment, he spoke again. "Do the children always stay close like that?" She followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him. "Yes." "Because of the riders?" A pause, not long, but noticeable. "Yes." He waited, expecting more. None came. The simplicity of her answers was starting to feel like a wall he kept running into. Not because she was hiding, but because she did seem interested in building explanations that required him to step into her past. He shifted slightly. "When I was watching yesterday," he said, choosing words carefully, "it didn't look like normal fear." Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in attention. "Fear isn't always normal," she said. That stopped him for a second. Because it wasn't a philosophical statement. It was something else. Something lived. The children laughed briefly at something between them. Just a short sound, quickly contained again, as if even joy had boundaries here. He glanced at them, then back at her. "You said not all riders are the same," he said. "What did you mean by that?" This time she didn't answer immediately, and in the pause that followed, he noticed something new. The wind changed direction, very slightly, and with it, the atmosphere around her seemed to tighten, not in panic, but in memory. She turned her head toward the road beyond the fence. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge it's not the riders, she said quietly. What followed them before? He didn't respond right away because the sentence didn't land as information. It landed as a warning that was meant for him specifically. The children had gone still again. The younger one moved closer to the older one without being told. He noticed that too. He pushed off the barn wall slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked. She didn't look at him when she answered. It means I learned to recognize patterns before they arrive. The words stayed in the air longer than expected. He looked toward the road again. Empty. Still, but suddenly less neutral than it had been before. He let out a slow breath. I'm not part of pattern, he said more quietly than intended. That time she did look at him fully, for the first time in a way that felt unguarded. I know, she said, and somehow that was heavier than doubt would have been. Silence returned after that, but it was different again. Not shared, not divided, just acknowledged. A few minutes passed with only the sound of water being adjusted in the trough and the distant movement of dry grass and wind. Then, without warning, a sound broke through the distance hooves. He noticed it first this time, not her, not because she wasn't aware, but because she didn't react immediately. That alone was new. He turned toward the road. 3 riders again, same direction, same pace. But this time, something inside him tightened not because of them, but because he watched her instead of the road. She had stopped moving entirely. Not frozen, but waiting. And then, instead of pulling the children away immediately, she hesitated, just for a second longer than before. That second mattered. The children looked at her first, not the riders. Then she moved, not rushed, not automatic, but chosen. She guided them toward the shed, but the speed was slightly different. Less urgency, more awareness. He watched her close the door again, but this time he didn't look away immediately. He stayed focused on the threshold of that action, on the repetition, on the structure of it. When the riders passed, nothing changed on the road. No deviation, no attention. Just distance, just dust. When the shed door opened again, she stepped out like before. But something inside him had shifted again. He realized something he hadn't admitted. It was just that she reacted to riders. It was that she believed she had to, and belief, he knew, was harder to break than fear. She looked toward the road once more before turning back to the yard, and this time he didn't let the moment pass without stepping closer. Not invading, just closing distance enough to be heard without effort. You don't have to do that every time, he said quietly. She stopped, not immediately responding. Then she looked at him, and for the first time there was something almost tired in her expression. Not exhaustion from work, exhaustion from repetition. You do, Dan, she said. I'm trying to, he replied. A pause then. She spoke again, softer than before. Trying just to change what the body remembers. And in that moment, he realized the truth of the ranch wasn't just in the broken fence, or the debt, or the land that refused to be held together. It was in the way people learned to survive things that never fully left them. Even when the road was empty, even when the riders had passed, even when nothing happened at all. By the 5th morning, the ranch felt less like a place recovering from neglect, and more like a place waiting for something it could not name. The man noticed it the moment he stepped outside. The air was heavier than usual, not in the way weather changes before a storm, but in the way silence becomes aware of itself. The land was still the same. Dry fence lines stretching into uneven ground, the barn leaning slightly with age, the road cutting across the horizon like a thin scar, and yet something about it no longer felt neutral. It felt watched, not by people, by history. He didn't speak that thought out loud. There was no one to hear it anyway. She and the children were not yet visible, but he could already tell where they were without seeing them. That had become another quiet change. Over the past few days, the way his attention now automatically searched for their presence before it registered anything else. It wasn't concern yet. Not exactly. more like awareness that had learned where to settle. He walked toward the east fence first, as he had every morning, but his steps slowed when he noticed something unusual near the gate. A horse had passed recently. Not a rider stopping, not a visit, just passage. But the ground was disturbed differently than usual. The hoof marks were deeper, more deliberate, as if the rider had slowed slightly at that exact point before continuing on. He stared at it longer than he should have. Then he heard movement behind him. She was there. No announcement, no sound of approach that he could identify. Just presence. She stood near the edge of the barn shadow with the children slightly behind her, positioned the same way they always were, now older one closer to her left, younger one half hidden by her right side. It was no longer panic that shaped their positions. It was structure, learned behavior, a system built from repetition. She followed his gaze toward the gate. Then she stopped, not physically, emotionally. He could see it in the way her posture subtly tightened, like something in her body recognized what her mind had not yet spoken. "Someone passed here," he said quietly. She didn't answer immediately. The children looked at the gate too, but they did not move closer. After a long moment, she spoke. "Yes, one word, but this time it carried more weight than before." He turned slightly toward her. "Same riders?" She hesitated longer this time then. "Not always the same men." That answer shifted something inside him. He frowned slightly, looking back at the tracks. "Then, what are they?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped forward a few feet, stopping just short of the disturbed ground. The children stayed where they were, watching her carefully. Her eyes dark, not fearfully, recognizing, like reading handwriting she had memorized long ago. "They don't all stop," she said finally, "but they all come this way, eventually." The man felt a slight tension in his jaw. "That does explain why you hide the kids every time," he said. She looked at him then, longer than usual, and for the first time there was something sharper beneath her calm. Not anger, but restraint that had been used too many times. "Because I don't get to decide which ones remember us," she said. He didn't respond immediately. The sentence didn't make full sense in a simple way, but it made sense in a deeper one. He exhaled slowly. "You lived here before," he said. Not as a question this time. She didn't deny it. That silence was answer enough. The children shifted slightly behind her. The older one looked toward the barn again, as if tracking something invisible. The younger one leaned closer to her leg. The man noticed all of it. And something about the pattern finally began to form in his mind, not fully shaped, but no longer random. "There was trouble here," he said carefully. Her eyes dropped briefly to the ground before returning to the gate. "Yes, still no elaboration." He took a step closer to the fence, resting one hand on the wood without fully leaning into it. "And it involved riders," he said. Another pause. Then she nodded. Not dramatic, not emotional, just confirmation. That was the moment the shape of the truth began to press against him. Even though it wasn't fully visible yet, he looked back toward the road, empty again. But now it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like expectation. "Are you waiting for them to come back?" he asked quietly. Her answer came after a long silence. "I don't think they ever left." The words stayed in the air longer than anything else had that morning. He turned toward her, fully now. "That's not how roads work," he said. She gave a faint, almost invisible shake of her head. "Not all of them are roads," she said. The man felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest, not fear, but recognition of how little he actually knew about what had shaped this land beyond the physical work of it. The children had gone quiet again, too quiet. He noticed that immediately. Are they in danger right now, he asked. She didn't, he answered right away. And that hesitation told him more than any word could have. She said, not right now. The emphasis was subtle, but it mattered. He studied her carefully now, not as someone hiring help, not even as someone trying to understand a stranger, but as someone realizing there were layers of reality on this land that had nothing to do with fences or debt or weather. You said, not right now, he repeated. She nodded once. That's how it works, she said. He frowned again. It is, she replied quietly. Just not one that stays the same. A distant wind moved across the yard, shifting dust near the barn door. The sound was small, but it broke the stillness, just enough to remind him the world outside this conversation still existed. He looked at the children again, then back at her. They've been hiding like this since you arrived, he said, before I hired you to correct him. Didn't confirm it either, but the way she held herself told him the answer was yes. He rubbed the back of his neck, briefly thinking. You can live like that forever, he said. Her eyes met his again, and this time there was something almost exhausted in them. We not living, she said. We staying out of reach. That sentence landed differently. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just factual in a way that made it harder to challenge. He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back toward the gate. The hoofprints were still there, still real, still unexplained in the way his mind wanted them to be. He finally spoke again, more slowly. If someone is coming back, I need to know what I am standing in the middle of. She didn't respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. You're standing in a place people learn to forget. That was all she said. No further explanation followed. The children moved slightly closer to her again, as if the conversation itself had changed temperature. The man remained where he was, one hand still resting on the fence, and for the first time since he'd come back to this land, he understood something he hadn't wanted to understand. The problem was not that the land was broken. It was that the people on it had learned to live around the breaks so long that they no longer remembered what whole meant. And somewhere beyond the empty road, in the space between memory and repetition, something unresolved still felt close enough to return. By the sixth morning, the ranch no longer felt like a place that simply held people. It felt like a place that held history in layers, some visible, most of it not, all of it quietly, pressing against the present like wind that never fully stopped moving. The man woke earlier than usual, though sleep had already become a thin thing for him lately. Not absent, but fractured. The kind of sleep that leaves you with the feeling you never fully left the day before. When he stepped outside, the first thing he noticed was that the air had changed again. Not in temperature, but in weight. It was subtle, the kind of most people would ignore. But out here, on land that offered little distraction, even small changes became difficult to dismiss. Something had been disturbed, not physically, socially. That was the only way he could describe it. He walked toward the barn first, but his attention was the fence today. Drifted instinctively toward the open stretch of land where riders passed. The hoofprints from yesterday were still faintly visible in the dry soil, but the wind had already begun its slow work of erasing them. Erasing evidence, he thought, or hiding it. He didn't like that thought. By the time he reached the yard, she was already there. That was no longer surprising. What was new was the way she stood, not relaxed, not tense either. Something in between. The children were beside her, closer than usual. The older child kept glancing toward the road, not in panic, but in anticipation. The younger one stayed almost completely still, holding on to the edge of her shirt without looking away from the ground. And then he saw the reason. A man had arrived. Not on horseback, on foot. That detail mattered more than anything else. He stood near the gate, not entering fully, not leaving either. The posture was deliberate, controlled. The kind of stance that came from someone who had learned how to occupy space without appearing to invade it. The man wasn't young, but not old either. Weathered in a way that suggested long hours outside, long years of dealing with land, people, or both. He wore a coat that had seen too many seasons, and boots that had been repaired more than replaced, but it wasn't his appearance that changed the atmosphere. It was the way she reacted. The moment she saw him, something inside her tightened. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough for the man observing to notice immediately. The children moved closer to her instinctively, and she did something she had not done in front of the ranch owner before. She stepped slightly in front of them, a barrier, subtle but unmistakable. The man at the gate spoke first. "I think I find you here." His voice carried familiarity. Not casual familiarity. Recognized familiarity. The ranch owner felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't T, a stranger. She didn't, T, answer immediately. Instead, her eyes flicked briefly toward the ranch owner, then back to the man at the gate. "That depends on what you looking for," she said carefully. The words were measured, controlled, but not calm in the way she usually was. There was history here. He could feel it. The man at the gate finally stepped forward one pace, but stopped before fully entering. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. That phrase alone changed the tone of everything, because people who say that usually have already caused it. The ranch owner remained where he was, but now he was fully alert. He had seen enough life to recognize when a moment stopped belonging to ordinary interaction and started belonging to something heavier. The children had gone completely still. The younger one pressed closer to her side. She didn't move them back. She didn't relax either. "I told you," she said quietly, "not here." The man at the gate sighed as if this conversation had been repeated before. "Not the one who decided where things ended," he said. The ranch owner took a slow step forward, not aggressive, but intentional enough to be noticed. "What is this?" he asked. The man at the gate finally looked at him directly, as if realizing he was T alone in this space. For a moment, there was silence. Then the man spoke. "I am looking for my niece," he said. The words landed differently than expected. Not because they were dramatic, because they were simple. Too simple for the tension they carried. The ranch owner looked toward her. She didn't deny it. That was the first fracture in the explanation. The man at the gate continued. "She disappeared from her last known location over a year ago. People said she came west. Said she was seen in this region." His eyes shifted briefly toward the children, then back to her. "Found her." The ranch owner felt the ground under the conversation shift slightly. Now he said, "She ran from you?" The man at the gate hesitated. That hesitation mattered. "She ran from something," he said finally. "I was trying to bring her back before she disappeared completely." The ranch owner looked between them again. The children, The distance she still kept between them and the man. And something began to assemble in his mind, not a conclusion yet, but a structure forming under pressure. "You said niece," he repeated. "Yes," the man at the gate replied. "And those children?" Silence followed, long enough to matter. Then she answered. "They mine, no hesitation, no ambiguity." But the way she said it wasn't defensive. It was final. The ranch owner felt something tighten in his chest again. But this time it wasn't confusion. It was realization that the situation was larger than what had been visible so far. The man at the gate looked at her more directly now. "They were not safe like this," he said. That sentence changed the air instantly, not because it was false or true, but because it implied authority over safety. She shook her head slightly. "They safer than before," she said. The ranch owner noticed something important then. She did not look at him when she said it. She was not defending herself to him. She was defending her existence against someone who had already defined it differently once before. The man at the gate stepped closer again, stopping just short of entering the yard fully. "You can keep hiding like this," he said. "I am not hiding," she replied. The ranch owner finally spoke, again, his voice more controlled now. "Then what are you doing?" She turned slightly toward him. And for the first time since she arrived on this land, there was something almost visible beneath her restraint. Not panic, not anger, fatigue shaped by endurance. "I'm staying where they don't look for me the way they used to," she said. The man at the gate frowned. "That doesn't make sense," he said. It does if you know what happened," she replied. But she didn't elaborate. Not yet. The children shifted again. The ranch owner noticed how they responded not to words, but to tone, to tension, to memory embedded in sound. He exhaled slowly. "Maybe someone should explain what happened," he said. The man at the gate nodded immediately. "Yeah," he said, "that's why I am here." She shook her head again. "No," she said, "that's why I left." And in that moment, the ranch owner stirred something that had been clear before. This wasn't just a search. It was a collision between two versions of truth. One that wanted answers, one that wanted silence. And between them stood a woman who had learned that safety sometimes depended not on being found, but on remaining just far enough away to exist at all. By the seventh morning, the ranch felt different in a way that could not be explained by weather or routine alone. It was still the same land-dry soil, leaning fences, the barn that creaked when the wind moved through its old joints, but something underneath it had shifted. Not visibly, not loudly, more like a pressure change in the atmosphere that everyone could feel without agreeing on what it meant. The man noticed it the moment he stepped outside, though he couldn't have said exactly why. The air felt watched again, not by people in the present moment, but by consequences that had finally arrived at the same place as truth. He didn't see her immediately. That alone was unusual now. By habit, his eyes went first to the shed, then to the barn, then to the open yard, where she usually stood with the children. But this morning, the space was partially empty, not abandoned, interrupted. He walked forward slowly, boots pressing into soil that felt harder than yesterday, or maybe that was only in his mind. Then he saw them. She was standing near the water trough, but she wasn't alone in the way she usually was. The children were still close to her, but their positions were different, less clustered, more uncertain. The older child stood slightly forward this time, as if trying to understand something without stepping fully into it. The younger one stayed close, but wasn't holding onto her clothing the way he usually did. And then there was the man from yesterday, the uncle. He had returned. This time he had entered the yard, not far. but far enough that the boundary had been crossed. He stood near the barn, not aggressive, not relaxed either. His posture carried a kind of controlled urgency, like someone who had spent too long preparing for a conversation that never gets easier, no matter how many times you rehearse it. The ranch owner slowed his steps but didn't stop. The woman saw him approaching. Her expression did not change immediately, but something in her posture tightened just slightly, as if the space between past and present had suddenly become smaller. The uncle spoke first. "We need to finish this," he said. The woman did not respond. The children looked at him instead of her this time. That detail mattered. The ranch owner stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear, but not close enough to interrupt. "Finish what?" he asked. The uncle turned his head slightly toward him. "This isn't your problem," he said. The ranch owner didn't react to the tone. "I think it might be," he replied quietly. A pause followed. Not dramatic, but heavy enough that even the wind seemed to slow. The woman finally spoke, her voice lower than before. "He doesn't know anything," said he. The uncle exhaled sharply. "Exactly why I'm here," he replied. "Because no one knows what actually happened except you, and you stopped explaining it when you left." The ranch owner felt the weight of that sentence settle between them. Stopped explaining. Not denied, not erased, just stopped. The children moved closer to her again, almost instinctively. She didn't stop them, but she didn't pull them in the way she used to either. That shift was subtle, but noticeable. Like she was trying to stand in the space between protection and exposure without collapsing into either. The ranch owner looked at her more carefully now. He had seen fear in people before, but this was not fear in the simple sense. It was containment, something held tightly enough that it shaped posture, silence, decision. The uncle spoke again. "You left after the hearing," he said, "after everything was supposed to be settled." The woman's jaw tightened slightly. "It wasn't as settled," she said. The uncle shook his head. "The court made its decision." "That doesn't mean it was right," she replied. The ranch owner felt a shift at that word. "Court?" "Nee." "Custody proceedings," he said. The words were simple, but they changed everything in the space between them. The ranch owner didn't respond immediately. He looked at the children instead, then back at her. "You were in a custody case?" asked quietly. She didn't confirm it in words either. The uncle continued. "She was accused of instability, of removing the children without consent after separation. It became a legal matter." The ranch owner felt something tighten in his chest. Not judgment, not sympathy yet, just the beginning of understanding that this situation had layers he had not been aware of. The woman finally spoke again. "They called it instability," she said quietly. "I called it leaving before it got worse." The uncle stepped forward slightly. "You don't get to decide that alone when children are involved." That sentence landed harder than the others, not because it was cruel, because it was structured like law. She looked at him fully, and for the first time since he had known her, there was something in her expression that was not simply controlled survival. It was exhaustion shaped by repetition of being interpreted by others. "I didn't leave because I wanted to disappear," she said. "I left because staying meant they would learn to accept things they shouldn't have to accept." The children were still listening, even if they did not fully understand the conversation. That mattered more than anything else in the moment. The ranch owner stepped slightly closer. Was there harm? He asked carefully. She hesitated, long enough that the answer was not simple. The uncle answered instead. There were concerns, he said. The ranch owner looked at him. Concerns aren't answers, he said. The uncle's expression tightened. Concerns are what courts act on, he replied. The woman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before. They said I was unstable because I stopped agreeing, she said. Because I stopped returning calls. Because I stopped participating in something I believed was already failing them. The ranch owner studied her face now, not as a worker, not as a stranger, but as someone standing inside a story that had already been told about her by others. And the children? He asked. Her answer came immediately this time. They are safe with me. The uncle shook his head. That's not what the ruling said. The ranch owner exhaled slowly. The ruling, he repeated, almost to himself. He looked at the children again. The older one was watching the uncle now, not with fear exactly, but with recognition that something important was being discussed about them without their full understanding. The younger one stayed closer to her leg. He realized then that none of this conversation was abstract for them. It was lived reality. The uncle spoke again. I didn't come here to argue, he said. I came because I was told you had disappeared with them. I thought something had happened to you. The woman gave a small, tired laugh that wasn't a humor. Something did happen, she said. It just didn't look like what you expected. The ranch owner felt the tension shift again. He looked at the uncle. And now? He asked. The uncle hesitated. Now mattered, because now was no longer legal history or emotional memory. Now was this yard, this moment, these children, standing between two versions of responsibility. I need to make sure they are not being kept in isolation, the uncle said finally. The woman's voice sharpened slightly. They are not in isolation, she said. They are in protection. The ranch owner finally understood the core conflict. It wasn't just custody, it was definition. What one side called protection, the other called harm. What one side called safety, the other called control. And in the middle, there was no neutral ground, only interpretation. He looked at the children again, then at the road beyond the fence, then back at her. And for the first time since this had begun, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. He was no longer just observing a situation. He was standing inside of decisions made long before he arrived. And whatever came next would not be about understanding what happened in the past, but deciding what kinds of safety still counted as safety in the present. By the 8th morning, the ranch no longer felt like a place holding a dispute. It felt like a place holding a fracture that had finally been exposed to air. The wind was stronger that day, not violent, not storm-like, but persistent in a way that made everything on the land feel slightly unstable. The fence line creaked more often. The barn door shifted, even when no one touched it. Dust moved across the yard in slow, uncertain waves, as if the ground itself could not decide where it belonged anymore. The man stood inside the barn longer than usual before stepping out. He was avoiding work. He was delaying contact with something he could no longer describe as a simple observation. Because what had begun as a quiet, unusual living arrangement had now become something heavier, something shaped by history, law, memory, and fear, all occupying the same small stretch of land. When he finally stepped outside, he already knew things were not the same as yesterday. He could feel it before he saw it. The air had changed again, and this time it was subtle. Near the water trough, she was there, but not in the way she had been before. She was sitting. That alone was unusual. The children were close to her, but not playing, not moving much. The older one sat with knees drawn up, arms wrapped loosely around them, eyes fixed on the ground. The younger one leaned against her side, not restless, but still. Still in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than calm. The uncle was not visible. That absence mattered immediately. The man slowed his steps as he approached. Something had already happened. He could tell from the way she held herself, not collapsed, not defeated, but lowered, as if the act of standing had temporarily become optional rather than necessary. When she noticed him, she did stand immediately. That was new. Usually, she adjusted herself quickly, like presence required readiness. Today, she simply looked at him and waited. He stopped a few feet away. The silence between them was no longer the kind that carried observation. It carried aftermath. "Where is he?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. The children did not look up. Finally, she spoke. "He left," she said. Just that. No explanation. No elaboration. The man glanced toward the gate. Empty. Still. "What happened?" he asked. She looked down at the younger child briefly before answering. "He got what he came for," she said. The sentence didn't clarify anything. It only deepened the uncertainty. The man stepped slightly closer, careful not to cross into their space too quickly. "That does sound like resolution," he said. She gave a faint, tired exhale. "It was supposed to be," she replied. The wind moved through the yard again, carrying dust low across the ground. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then he noticed something in her posture. Not fear, not panic, but depletion, the kind that comes after sustained tension, rather than a single event. "You're shaking," he said quietly. She didn't deny it. Instead, she adjusted the younger child closer to her side without fully changing her position. "It's over for now," she said. "For now," he repeated. That phrase was becoming familiar. Too familiar. She nodded slightly. The children remained still. Too still. He crouched slightly, so he was closer to their level. Not directly in front of them, but angled so he wasn't blocking their view of anything. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head once. "No," she said, but her voice didn't fully support certainty. He noticed that immediately. The older child looked at him, then briefly, cautiously, the kind of look that suggested awareness of adult conversations without full understanding of their meaning. The man exhaled slowly and straightened again. "What did he want?" he asked. She hesitated. Longer this time. Then she said, "To confirm I'm non-stable." The word hung in the air, unstable. He had heard it before in fragments, but hearing it from her again gave it new weight. "That's not something you confirm," he said quietly. "It is when someone already decided it," she replied. The man looked toward the barn, then back to her. "And did he change his mind?" She paused. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Finally, she said, "He stopped trying to change it." That answer felt like a partial truth. Or a shifted one. The man frowned slightly. "That's not the same as believing you," he said. "I didn't need him to believe me," she replied. A pause followed, then softer. "I needed him to stop coming here like I was something to correct." The wind shifted again, brushing through the dry grass near the fence line. The children shifted slightly closer to her again, as if reacting not to words, but to emotional temperature. The man watched them carefully, then "You've been holding this alone for a long time," he said. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. "Yes, that was all. No justification, no explanation, just acknowledgement." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then he looked toward the road, empty again. But emptiness now carried a different meaning. It wasn't Seps, it was temporary safety. He turned back to her. "What happens next?" he asked. She looked at him. Then, for the first times he had known her, there was something in her expressions that would simply controlled endurance. It was uncertainty, not about danger, about continuation. "I don't know," she said honestly. The honesty landed heavier than anything else. The children remained close. The older ones shifted slightly, as if responding to the tone rather than the words. The man stepped a little closer again, but still stopped short of her space. "You could stay here," he said slowly, "until things are clearer." She didn't answer immediately. He added more carefully, "This place is already halfway to broken. It can handle waiting." A faint expression crossed her face. At that something almost like acknowledgement of irony. "That's not the concern," she said. "What is?" he asked. She looked down at the children again. Then back at him. "Being in one place too long makes it easier for people to find you." The words were not paranoid. They were learned. He understood that now. "You don't think it's over," he said quietly. "I think it pauses," she replied. Along. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with interpretation. The man finally spoke again. Trustin?" he asked. Funny, Manistusha, he was ambidut. She was trusting absence of harm, of intrusion, of correction. That was the level she had learned to operate from. He nodded slowly. "I didn't stop them," he said quietly, referring to the uncle. She shook her head slightly. "You didn't need to," she replied. "He wasn't here for you." That landed differently. He realized then that he had been part of the environment, but not the center of the conflict. He was a witness, not a participant in origin. But that didn't make him irrelevant. It made him positioned. He looked at the children again, then back at her. "They shouldn't grow up like this," he said quietly. Her response was immediate, but not defensive. "Neither should you," she said. That stopped him because it wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reflection, a reminder that survival had shaped everyone differently here. Not just her. Not just the children. Even him. The wind moved again, slower this time. He looked at the barn, then the fence, then the road. And for the first time since all of this began, he realized something uncomfortable but clear. This was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about deciding what kind of future could exist after people stopped trying to define each other through their past. And in that space, between what was known and what was still unresolved, the ranch did not feel empty anymore. It felt like it was waiting for someone to choose whether silence would remain a form of survival or become something closer to living. By the ninth morning, the ranch felt quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after tension has passed the place but hasn't fully left it, like air after thunder. Or a room after an argument that ended without resolution. Nothing moved the way it used to. Even the wind seemed less certain of its direction, brushing the dry grass in slower, softer passes as if it was no longer sure whether it should disturb anything at all. The man noticed it immediately when he stepped outside. He had learned over the past days that nothing on this land changed without reason. Even stillness carried meaning here. And this morning, the stillness felt deliberate. He walked toward the yard, expecting to see her near the water trough or the barn. But for the first time in several days, she was T in her usual place. That alone tightened something in his chest. The children were there, though, sitting close together near the edge of the barn wall, not playing, not speaking, just waiting. The older child's arms were wrapped loosely around his knees again, while the younger leaned slightly into his side. Neither of them looked at the man when he approached, but they didn't move away either. That was new. Their reaction no longer included escape. It included recognition. He slowed his steps. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. Neither child answered. Not because they didn't hear him, but because they weren't the ones expected to answer. A moment later, she appeared from the side of the barn. Not abruptly, not cautiously, just arriving into view like she had been there longer than he realized. But something about her was different this morning. Not physically changed, but emotionally shifted in a way that was hard to define at first glance. She stopped a few feet away from the children and placed a hand lightly on the younger one's shoulder. The gesture was automatic, grounding, familiar. But her eyes did not immediately meet his. When they did, there was no urgency in them, only clarity. He felt it before she spoke. Something had been decided. The uncle was gone. The legal pressure, at least for now, had receded. But this was not relief in the way he expected. It was something else, something heavier. He stepped closer, careful not to interrupt the space she was standing in. "What happened last night?" he asked quietly. She took a moment before answering. Not because she was unsure of the facts, but because she was choosing how to present them. "He signed something," she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight beneath them. The man frowned slightly. "What kind of something?" he asked. She exhaled so slowly, glancing briefly toward the road, beyond the fence, before returning her gaze to him. "A release," she said. "Temporary custody withdrawal. Agreement not to pursue immediate enforcement." The man absorbed that slowly. "That sounds legal," he said. "It is," she replied. A pause followed. The children shifted slightly closer to her again, as if sensing the tone change, even if they didn't understand the meaning of the words. "And that means?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "It means..." He agreed not to take them right now. The emphasis on right now was not accidental. It hung in the air between them. The man looked at her carefully. "That's not the same as it being over," he said. "No," she'd agreed quietly. The wind moved through the yard, died again, slower than before, like even it was listening. She adjusted her hand on the child's shoulder slightly, then looked down at both of them for a moment, longer than usual. Then she said something that changed the tone of the morning completely. "I need to decide what comes after this." The man understood what she meant, not in consequence. This wasn't tea resolution. This was a pause before direction. He nodded slowly. "You were thinking of leaving," he said. "It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it, but she did to confirm it. Either that silence was the answer." The children looked up at her now. That detail mattered more than anything else in the moment. They weren't reacting to the man. They were reacting to the shift in her tone. He noticed that immediately. "You don't have to decide right now," he said carefully. She gave a faint, almost tired exhale. "That is what people always say," she replied. "But decisions don't wait for comfort." He didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. He looked toward the barn, then the fence, then the road again. And for the first time, he felt something that wasn't confusion or observation. It was proximity to loss, not because something had ended, but because something had become temporary in a way it hadn't been before. He turned back to her. If you leave, he said quietly, what happens to them? She didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice was softer than before. They stay with me. That was not the uncertainty. That was the certainty. He nodded. I meant where, he clarified. She looked at the children again, then back at him. I don't know yet, she admitted. That admission mattered, because it was the first time she had spoken about the future without structure. The man exhaled slowly. The ranch felt different under that realization. Not broken, not healed, but transitional. You could stay here longer, he said. She looked at him then, fully, for a long moment, and something in her expression softened not into trust exactly, but into consideration. This place still carries risk, she said. So does everywhere, he replied. A faint silence followed. Not heavy this time, just real. The children shifted slightly again, the young one resting more fully against her side now. The man noticed that too. Then he said something he hadn't planned. I want to ask you to stay, he said, but I also want to pretend this place is nothing to them anymore. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in attention. He continued carefully. They stopped hiding as much, he said. That means something changed here. She looked at the children again. Longer this time, then back at him. It means they learned I'm not always running. She said. The man nodded, and I learned I don't have to risk danger every time something unfamiliar happens, he replied. A faint shift passed through her expression. Not agreement, but recognition. Silence followed again. But this time, it didn't feel like absence, it felt like space. After a moment, she spoke quietly. If I stay longer, she said, it wouldn't be because I trust everything here. He nodded. That's fine, he said. You don't have to. That answer seemed to land differently than the others. Not because it solved anything, but because it didn't demand resolution. She studied him for a long moment, then looked at the children, then back on, finally, said, one more week. It was a promise of permanent. It was something in between. A pause made intentional. The man nodded once. All right, he said simply. No celebration, no relief, just acceptance. The wind moved again through the yard, brushing past the barn, through the fence line, across the open road that no longer felt entirely empty. And for the first time in days, the silence that followed did not feel like waiting for something to break. It felt like something had chosen, however briefly, not to run. By the 10th morning, the ranch felt like it was learning a new way to breathe. It was still the same land-dry earth, where weathered wood, fences that leaned slightly no matter how many times they were fixed, but something about it no longer felt like it was holding its breath. The silence still there, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. It didn't press against the skin the way it used to. It simply existed, like something finally allowed to be part of the day instead of something waiting for it to end. The man noticed it as soon as he stepped outside. He didn't look for her immediately this time. That was the first change he registered in himself. Instead of scanning the yard for signs of absence or alarm, his attention settled naturally on the space as a whole. The barn, the fence line, the road beyond it, everything felt like it belonged to the same present moment instead of competing versions of it. Then he saw them. She was near the water trough again, but not alone in tension the way she had been before. The children were with her, but there was a looseness in their posture now that had existed a week ago. The older child stood a little apart, kicking at the dirt without urgency. The younger one crouched nearby, drawing something simple into the soil lines that didn't look like fear anymore, just play. She noticed him approaching and didn't move immediately. That was no longer, it was natural now. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, none of them spoke. The wind moved through the yard, light and steady, carrying dust without direction rather than purpose. Finally, she spoke first. "We're staying," she said. It wasn't announced like a decision that needed approval. It was stated like something that had already settled into place. The man nodded slowly. "Longer than a week," he said. She looked at him briefly, then back at the children. "Yes," she said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation. He glanced toward the barn, then the fence, then the road beyond it. The same road that had once meant warning, repetition, uncertainty. Now it looked like something else entirely, distance, not a threat. He turned back to her. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she was uncertain, because she was measuring something that didn't have easy language. Finally, she said, "I'm not sure of everything, but I'm sure they don't need to grow up only knowing how to disappear." The children didn't react to the words, but something in their stillness changed slightly, as if they understood the tone, even if not the meaning. The man nodded again. "That's fair," he said. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared after a moment. She looked at him more directly than she had in days. "You did ask me to explain everything," she said. He gave a small, almost tired exhale. "I stopped thinking I had a right to," he replied. That made her pause, not in surprise, in recognition. The wind shifted slightly again, brushing through the yard in a slow pass that stirred the dust near their feet. She looked down at the younger child, who was now pressing a small shape into the dirt, with focused concentration. She spoke again, softer this time. "You could have made me leave," she said. He shook his head once. "I could have tried," he corrected, "but it wouldn't have made things safer." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "No," she agreed. The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. It wasn't filled with danger or uncertainty or waiting. It was simply space where understanding no longer needed to be forced. The man shifted his weight slightly, looking at the barn one last time. "You'll still work the land?" he asked. She gave a faint nod. "If you still need me," she said. "I do," he replied. "Not as dependence, as continuation." The children moved a little closer to her again, but not out of fear, out of habit, out of comfort. She placed a hand lightly on the older child's shoulder, then looked at the man again. "There is something else," she said. He waited. She hesitated briefly, then added, "This place does feel like something I need to survive anymore." He understood what she meant without needing it explained. The ranch was no longer a boundary between danger and safety. It was becoming something closer to a place where life could exist without constant calculation. He nodded slowly. "That's enough," he said. She gave a faint look. That might have been agreement, or might have been gratitude, or might have simply been acknowledgement. It did need to be defined. The wind moved once more across the open land, carrying with it the sound of nothing in particular. The children began to move again, small, ordinary motions that no longer carried tension. And for the first time since everything begun, the man didn't feel like he was watching something fragile. He felt like he was standing by something that had finally decided it did not need to vanish to remain safe. The road beyond the fence stretched out as it always had, but it no longer looked like an escape route or just a road, and in the quiet that followed, the ranch remained. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
This story is not just about a woman hiding her children, or a cowboy who chooses to stay when everyone else rides past. At its core, it is a story about what fear does to the human spirit when it is left unspoken for too long, and what healing can look like when someone finally chooses presence over judgment. In the world of the American West, survival has always been tied to distance, caution, and silence. People learn quickly who to trust and even faster who to avoid. But sometimes that instinct for survival becomes so deeply rooted that it begins to shape everyday life long after the original danger is gone. The woman in this story is not simply hiding from riders on the road, she is living inside a memory of fear that never fully released its grip on her. And in doing so, she teaches us something important. Trauma does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like routine. Sometimes it looks like protection repeated so often it becomes identity. The cowboy in this story represents something equally important, not heroism in the traditional sense, but patience. He does not force answers. He does not demand truth on his own timeline. Instead, he learns to observe, to wait, and to accept that understanding another person requires more than curiosity. It requires respect for what they are not ready to say. His role reminds us that real strength is not in control, but in restraint. Not in fixing people, but in giving them the safety to stop running. At the heart of this story is the children. They are not just background characters, they are the future shaped by the emotional environment around them. Their silence, their hiding, and their gradual change reflect how deeply children absorb the fears of the adults who protect them. And when the environment begins to shift, when trust is slowly rebuilt, they are the first to show what healing can look like in its earliest form. The moral lesson of this story is simple, but powerful. People do not always need to be saved. Sometimes they need to be seen without being judged, and safety is not always created by removing danger, but by building trust strong enough to face it together. It also reminds us that truth is not always immediate, and understanding is not always comfortable. Many people carry stories they cannot explain right away, not because they are hiding something wrong, but because their experiences have taught them that being misunderstood can be more dangerous than being silent. Ultimately, this is a story about choosing presence over assumption, patience over control, and compassion over fear. It asks us to consider how often we rush to interpret others instead of simply standing beside them long enough to understand. If this story moved you in any way, please take a moment to like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe. This channel is dedicated to Western stories of cowboys, quiet strength, motherhood, human resilience, and the deep emotional connections that form in the hardest and most forgotten corners of life.